Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, we are having discussion on philosophy and practices of education in India. We'll try to know today the evolution of educational philosophy, its strengths, weaknesses, and how society has responded to philosophy of education. We'll also try to understand a historical outline, and we'll see the contemporary situation where our educational philosophy fit into. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in studio an eminent educationist, Dr. Deepak Kumar. He is presently Professor of History of Education and Science at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has written many books and published many articles in different journals. And moreover that, he is known for his contribution in the history of science, technology, environment and medicine. He is a known expert of these fields, and presently also busy with writing a very unique book, Making of Knowledge Society. So certainly his knowledge and experience will help us to understand educational philosophy in India in a new way, and will give an insight and perspective to understand the educational policy in India. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. Kumar for EduSet lecture on this very topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity. India, from time immemorial, has been a knowledge-oriented society. We were never xenophobic, never inert. It had been a thinking civilization all along its long history. In the deep ancient past, we had compositions which came down to us as Shruti, as part of the oral tradition. Remarkable compositions of great human intellect and understanding, known as the Vedas, the later compositions, Upanishads, Brahmanas, Smritis, Mimamsas, later numerous commentaries known as Tika, Bhashya, Nighantu, etc. So, right from recorded history, we have a continuous tradition of philosophical thinking, and all this has left for us a huge corpus of knowledge which has impressed and sometimes baffled the world at large. We produced epics which epitomized the knowledge of that period. We had individuals who left their mark through their teachings, especially the emergence of Buddha and Mahavir as great teachers, great masters. who left behind a huge tradition which gradually kept on growing of investigations in the realm of ideas, in the realm of human activities, and so forth. Scholars recognize that in India the philosophical tradition was so strong that at a later day India came to be considered as a fountain of knowledge. The term which we find in ancient literature is jnana, and at the same time another important term is vidya. Under jnana, broadly translated knowledge, so many things come. It's rubric, it's a huge umbrella. The whole gamut of human thinking and activities can be seen under it. Vidya was also taken as a process whereby this knowledge was generated as well as disseminated. Generation, dissemination continued together. One of the earliest example of our elucidation of the purpose of knowledge was the saying sa vidyaya vimuktai, where the knowledge is used for liberation. Unlike the Greek philosophers, where knowledge came to be associated with power, in the South Asian civilization, knowledge came to be associated not with control but with liberation. However, as some critics point out, liberation from what? Was it liberation from hunger, disease? Liberation from what? Probably we gave this term liberation a spiritual turn, liberation of the soul. Whichever we may take things, the fact remains that the Indians did develop a tradition of knowledge, an educational philosophy, and also a pedagogy of their own. So you have quite early educational institutions like Takshila, references to educate the princes and other commoners are found in the epics, Mahabharata, Ramayana, and many other places. There were certain social difficulties also, which is reflected in the instance of Eklavya trying to learn on his own, but still acknowledging the spiritual guidance received from a known master, and in the end paying a price for it. So the tradition continued with its own strength and weaknesses, One thing which comes readily into mind if one has to characterize how did this development took place, what was the defining feature of this development, I would say it was done through writing commentaries. Writing commentary was one of the way to advance knowledge, probably the most important way to advance knowledge. One may probably also notice that the number of total break with the past, or what modern philosopher may call paradigm shift, was less. Still, the process continued. Paradigm shifts may have been rare, but this doesn't mean that addition or subtraction in the knowledge system didn't exist. Gradually one finds that in the Indian knowledge tradition there appeared what one may call canonized knowledge, Shastra Sammat Gyan. Once Gyan became Shastra Sammat, that means sanctioned by tradition and the authority, it was very difficult for the subsequent generations to challenge it. For example, once a particular treatise or text received support and became Shastra Sammat Gyan, then the subsequent writings on that particular discipline or treatise would pay respect to the previous one and would make little adjustment, some addition, some subtraction, and continue the process. For example, we have Charak Samhita or many other Samhitas, which in course of time became the standard works, Mapdand, and thereafter subsequent generations people wrote Nighantus, commentaries on it, and they all recognized the significance of the older Samhita. It had certain advantages because even if people differed, they differed with due politeness, due respect. But the disadvantage it that a canonized knowledge prevented asking uncomfortable questions which could have led to a topsy-turvy situation. That was very adroitly avoided, and the people and the establishment took the safer course. This continued for a long time. In terms of astronomy, for example, another instance can be found in a 6th century astronomer Brahmagupta explaining why scientifically solar or lunar eclipse took place. He knew the real reason. Still, later he argued that Puranas must be wrong because must be right because in the Puranas it was written that it is the demon Rahu which causes the eclipse. So you will find great minds going one step forward and then going 2 steps backward. There was nothing unusual in it, because many other societies similar things happened. Long before, Socrates had to take poison, and much later also there were philosophers and thinkers and scientists who suffered at the hands of canonized knowledge and its practitioners, suffered at the hands of theology. When Islam arrived, there was great hope. In fact, the first 3 centuries of Islamic civilization produced a remarkable number of scholars who put emphasis on reason without controverting the canonical text which the Holy Quran was and is. A remarkable tradition emerged in which the rationalists and the theologians lived together, of course with some compromise, some understanding. There were scholars like Al-Razi who had to suffer also. Once he was given 50 lashes because he claimed that truth was supreme and universal. There were other examples also. Ibn Sina, the great author of Al-Qanun, survived several attempts of persecution. Still, the knowledge tradition continued to flourish. It was from 11th century, 12th century onward that purity or fundamentalism or belief in fundamentals became very strong, thanks to the philosophical propoundings of scholars like Al-Ghazali. India received post-Ghazali Islam, and therefore here the educational philosophy which entered as part of the new ruling class and the educational practices which came as part of the madrasa, maktabs, etc., again emphasized the primacy of theology and jurisprudence over falsafa and hikmat. In both the ancient as well as medieval Indian tradition, there had been a disjunction, sometime comfortable, sometime uncomfortable, between para, apara, later deen, dunya, which means this worldly and that worldly. It had been going on for a long time. By and large, thanks to the influence of religion, both varieties organized as well as unorganized, South Asian culture was found oriented more towards para or deen, that is the other world, than dunya, that was this world. So this disjunction continued, and people somehow were interested more in other worldly considerations, worried about what happens after death, and education was considered as a means to achieve liberation. Real knowledge was supposed to be the knowledge which gives you a clue about what happens in the other world, or comprehension of God, or how the nature function, etc. This, however, does not mean that apara vidya or dunyavi talim were not considered at all. They got a place. They got reflections in popular culture, they got reflected in several other philosophies like Tantra. Earlier, Buddhism itself had been a very rational philosophy. Buddhism, as you know, doesn't talk of God, nor does it promise hell and heaven. Similarly, there were several other smaller traditions which existed but gradually were subsumed by the larger traditions. In Islam also, you had the undercurrent of several contradicting traditions. So, you have a high scholarly Islam, you have a folk Islam, you have very committed Puritans, and at the same time you have Sufis and Awliyas who put emphasis on experience, anubhuti. Actually, this relationship between experience, anubhuti and logic, tarka, continued all through Indian philosophical tradition. In ancient Indian literature, you will come across words like yukti, which means reason. Charak himself talked about yukti bheshaj. Similarly, there were terms used tarka, logic, anvikshiki, investigative reasoning, pramana, evidence. These were the existence of these terms and the use of these terms show that our ancestors had a very thoughtful and free philosophical discourses. In medieval times also, there were traditions which were non-conformist. As late as 17th century, 18th century, you have in Lucknow a curriculum, an educational curriculum known as Darshan-e-Nizami, which put emphasis, sometimes more emphasis, on reasoning, hikmat, falsafa, than on jurisprudence, Islamic jurisprudence or theology. But in sharp contrast, in Delhi, we had Shah Waliullah's madrasa, which put more emphasis on the fundamentals of the religion, very purist kind of teaching. So, different strands were going on. Indian educational philosophy, I would like to argue, was never arid, one-dimensional or unilinear. It encompassed several contradictions and moved along with the passage of time. Responding to the societal needs and very often using knowledge as a means to control the society. This gradually got reflected in the consolidation of the caste system, whereby knowledge came to be controlled by the dominant section of the society, while gradually a disjunction appeared between mind and hand. Those who worked with hands, with fingers, artisans, potters, carpenters, smiths, and those who lived in the Garbhagriha of the society and excelled in speculative philosophy. Had this disjunction been removed, one may conjecture India would have made more progress. However, for some reason or the other, Indian society remained obsessed more with metaphysics, more with social engineering, more with experiential religion, anubhuti, than with pramana. Most of our philosophers, even Adi Shankara himself said that shushka tarka, dry reasoning, didn't impress him. He would have preferred anubhuti, experience, experiential knowledge. Later, India produced a number of remarkable social reformers, right from Chaitanya Ramanujan to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Kabir, Nanak, many others. We had a bhakti movement while Europe was witnessing scientific revolution. Post Renaissance and Reformation, Europe made remarkable progress in terms of both scientific ideas and tool making. The educational philosophy there underwent a radical, remarkable change, a paradigm shift. Several paradigm shifts took place. Be it Copernicus, Harvey, Vesalius, Newton, many more names. The changes that took place were simply mind-boggling, momentous. While in India, we produced number of remarkable social reformers. This shows that the trajectories of these two civilizations were different. Whatever the reason, the society which excelled in making new knowledge and new tools gradually started conquering different parts of the world, and within a century and a half, almost 70% of the world came to be colonized by them. India also suffered colonization. It had to undergo colonization. Our knowledge system, unfortunately, was no match to those who ventured or entered us via the sea and started capturing our ports and fortresses one by one. This colonization, one may argue, probably lay in the logic of history. The way human civilization had advanced and how it differed from one culture area to another culture area. The way knowledge was perceived, the way education spread, all these played a role in this process. When new knowledge arrived in India, new tools came to India in the middle or end of the 18th century. Some of the Indian scholars looked at the challenges that lay before them. There were some erudite Indians who even dared to visit England. Itisamuddin from Dhaka, Abu Talib from Awadh, some more. They went to England, saw the society there, looked into the power of steam which was being used to generate new economy, new ideas. When they came back to India, they wrote about it. They were influenced by the material changes that had taken place in that part of the world, and they reflected upon the fate of their own society. But at the same time, they also felt that in terms of social relations, family, bonhomie, etc., the Indian society was superior to the Western or the other societies. One of the first Indian to realize the significance of this cultural encounter was Rahman Roy. He is known as the father of modern India. He was an educationist par excellence. He didn't have the benefit of modern education. He studied at the Madrasa in Patna, because those days Calcutta had no educational institution. And later he helped establish the Hindu College, wrote the famous letter to Lord Amherst asking for new knowledge, new sciences, and gave the Indians a new philosophy called Brahmo, whereby he talked in terms of a new religion based on reason, a religion of reason. Tark Yukta Dharma. His successors like Maharishi Devendranath Tagore and many others talked in terms of pramana or self-evidence, which he described that some of them could be Swayam Siddha, self-explanatory, universal in nature, while others could be Vijnana Moolak, which would undergo a particular scientific test, a process before entering the corpus of knowledge. So you have in early 19th century, mid 19th century, a number of people who tried to look at their past inheritance, their philosophical inheritance, their educational problems from a new perspective, from a new understanding, नई दृष्टि से. And this you will find in the course of debates in mid 19th century, late 19th century, almost whole of 19th century. You have this century is so rich in terms of educational dialogue. You have the great Vidyasagar, a Sanskritist, a traditional philosopher, who would not close the doors to modern knowledge. In his classes, he would teach both Puranas as well as Copernicus. And he gave the students the liberty to decide on their own what to accept from the Indian tradition and what to reject. It is again during this period that we come across several rebels in the Indian society. Michael Madhusudhan Datta, many others who even took to Christianity. And gave a critical look at their own tradition, which they had inherited. Without despising it, with an eye over improvement. Numerous examples can be cited, down to Swami Vivekananda, late 19th century. You have the educational ideas permeating the whole of 19th century. Everybody, whether a traditional scholar, an orthodox scholar, or those who were exposed to Western learning schools, etc., everybody contributed to this debate. You have Devindranath Tagore, Akshay Kumar Dutt, Mahendra Lal Sarkar, who founded the Indian Association for Cultivation of Science, the laureate Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, a missionary educationist like Father Lafont, and many more who contributed to this debate, and consequent upon the debate, building new institutions, educational institutions. It is in the 19th century, Victorian India, that great institutions were founded, on which rests today's modern India. You have Calcutta Medical College, established 1835, Engineering College, Roorkee, 1845, Grant Medical College, Bombay, 1845. 1857, the universities in Presidency towns, Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, and many more followed. All these institutions were preceded by educational debates, and in all these institutions, educational debates were carried on. They were the symbols of new educational philosophy, new educational practices. Some of them, of course, it was natural, were modeled on European experiments, on European examples. But there were many things which were unique to Indian culture which got reflected there. And it continued. There were 4 questions which came up in the minds of our forefathers as well as the educational planners. One was, why to teach? In educational practice, it is very important to know Why to teach? Our ancient forefathers had talked about vimuktaye, so to teach for liberation. The British thought that they wanted to teach for character formation. Most of the colonial records, even today, many people talk in terms of education as character formation. Charitra Nirman, as if humans are born without character. No. Still, Charitra Nirman we are obsessed with. This is a colonial legacy. The British thought that the Indians were deficient in character, therefore, the education which they wanted to impart would be geared to cure that deficiency. Macaulay had dismissed Indian literature, Asian literature as not worth a single shelf of the European library. Indians were found like children, deficient, ignorant, in many ways superstitious. So, therefore, new education would provide them with improvement. The purpose of education was considered improvement, moral and material improvement through character formation. So, why to teach? The British gave this explanation. Second question which became prominent during that period and which still continues with us. How to teach? What would be the medium? Lot of discussions took place which is known as Anglicist Orientalist controversy. When some people wanted to teach through the Indian languages, there was a section which wanted it through English, which was found to be the fountain and the source of new knowledge. Finally, the famous minute of Lord Macaulay 1835 put a seal, and English was introduced as the official language, in a sense that the teaching in government schools had to be, in the colleges had to be through this language. Medium of instruction is an issue which continues with us even now. I am myself talking to you in a language which is neither my mother tongue nor your mother tongue, but for some reason or the other it brings us together, the country. It has become the lingua franca of the country, despite numerous 15 or 16 national languages that we have constitutionally granted. So, how to teach was another question discussed all through, and it's still, the question is still with us. Third was what to teach. What could be the course? The colonizers felt that Indians needed more of liberal education than techno-scientific education. Give them Shakespeare, more of Shakespeare than of Euclid, because their exposure to Shakespeare would probably redress their character deficiency. And therefore, India received a curriculum, an educational curriculum, which was geared more to produce clerks and lower division, lower class technical people than thinkers, scientists, and so forth. Despite this limitation, India did produce a number of thinkers and scientists, which speaks volumes of the grit and energy of our forefathers who were trying to assert Indian identity in the face of a colonial onslaught. Fourth question with which they grappled was whom to teach. The Indian society, unfortunately, had confined knowledge to a certain privileged section of the society. Women were deprived, so were several other sections, especially the artisan, the lower sections of the Indian society. They had been deprived of it for centuries and centuries. The British also thought that in order to perpetuate their rule, to consolidate their rule, they needed the help from those established pillars of the society. So, give them the right education, the new education only to those established pillars of the society, which would help consolidate their rule. Give you one example. In 1845, when Grant Medical College was opened in Bombay, for 7-8 years, no students turned up. The classes were very few students came. The classes were empty. Indian students were not responsive because in the new medical college, dissection of the dead body would be done, and therefore the upper caste Hindus didn't want to join. The principal of the Grant Medical College wrote to the DPI of Bombay asking permission to open the college to lower sections of the society. The DPI shot back saying, "We have come here to rule, not to cause social upheaval. If you open new knowledge to lower sections of the society, they will get new knowledge, get empowered, go back to the society, and then demand higher status. This will create lot of confusion and social upheaval. Avoid it." The DPI argued that once the Brahmins realized that there was money in modern medicine and medical knowledge, they would come in hundreds. This is what happened later. He was true. So, this question of whom to teach was also very significant. Today, lot of discussion is going on in terms of reservation, in terms of giving opportunities to the depressed classes, etc., etc. That debate continues. Whom do we want to teach? We talk of education for all, health for all, Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan and all sorts of things. But this Sarva is still a problematic. To what extent it is Sarva, and to what extent it serves the Sarva. Everybody talks of Sarvajan and Sarva Sukhaya and so forth, but it is part of rhetoric than a practice. In early 20th century, we come across some change in the educational scenario, because the Indian national movement had gained strength and almost all nationalist leaders were demanding educational reforms. Lajpat Rai wrote on education. Gokhale himself was an educationist. In 1911, he asked for universal education. Even after a century later, we are unable to provide this. Universal education. Every significant, important national leader talked about the relevance of education and talked about and gave their own understanding of the educational philosophy and what needed to be done and so forth. So, educational debate in India had been fairly rich, very rich. Around this time, Mahatma Gandhi appears. He also talked about education. He believed that before the British came, there was an educational system which did serve the then existing society, but once the British arrived, that what he called beautiful tree perished, and the British provided in its place a type of education which was calculated to produce slaves, sarkari gulams. He had a point, but probably he overshot the mark. There was no point romanticizing pre-colonial past. Pre-colonial past was not a worthy example. It had its own deficiencies, lots of deficiencies. So to say that there existed a beautiful tree was probably a metaphor which Gandhi used for political purposes. He was challenged on this by some Britishers, especially the Vice Chancellor of Dhaka University, Philip Harto. And he asked Gandhi, please prove that in pre-British India education was flourishing. How many schools you had? How many students went? There was no data. Gandhi couldn't have proved it. As a rhetoric, you can always say that, ancient India was a golden period, etc., but it was difficult to prove. However, his emphasis on basic education, Zakir Hussain Sahab supported him and many others. You will see that Gandhi did lay down a philosophy, educational philosophy, which was supposed to serve the Indian society in terms of the requirements of that period. Gandhi's contribution definitely lies in making it relevant to the day-to-day life. Gandhi's contribution definitely lies in putting emphasis on hand, not only on mind, but on fingers, on hand, and thereby make education socially useful. The Wardha report on education is significant in this respect. There were several commissions later came, Radhakrishnan Committee, 1948. Before that, we have a National Planning Committee, 1937 onward, which talked about education. Later, 1966, we have Kothari Commission, very significant. 1985, new education policy, Ramamurthy Commission, and number of Yashpal Committee. Recently, the industrialist reports, Birla Ambani report on education, and now the famous Knowledge Commission. India is probably the only one country to have a Knowledge Commission. So numerous reports exist, right from Wardha to today's Knowledge Commission, 70 years, 80 years. Educational debate, numerous commissions, numerous recommendations, they are all galore. It is in implementation that we have faltered. In discussions, we have excelled. Diagnosis is there. Everybody has diagnosed in his own way. The politicians, the industrialists, the cultural interlocutors, the scientists, the educationists, everybody have given their own diagnosis and recipe also. Still, the fact is that more than half of the Indian population still remains illiterate. Indian expenditure on higher education is less than 1%. Total educational expenditure around 3.5 or 4%. Tertiary education suffers, vocational education suffers. We may have some IITs and one or two more institutions which claim a world-class status, but they do not generate cutting-edge knowledge. What they generate are undergraduates trained for the service sector, of the world economy. None of our educational institutions figure in the top 200 or even 300 educational institutions. Difficult to find few names which had made a paradigm shift in independent India, unlike colonial India, which produced a J.C. Bose, Satyen Bose, Meghnath Saha, C.V. Raman, few more. Today we do face this dilemma. What makes a knowledge society? What educational philosophy should be? What educational practices should be? Should it be geared to serve the market, or should it be geared for higher goals, to participate in the global knowledge generation and its dissemination to different sections of the society? We need to look into it from both historical as well as sociological angles and plan accordingly. Educational debate in India has always been dense. We need to benefit from it and see that certain firm decisions are taken and implemented for at least a particular period, so that tangible results are visible and can be seen. It is possible, given the political will, it is possible to look into the questions afresh on why to teach, how to teach, whom to teach, and what to teach. And if one of the problem is that education in India is both a state as well as central concurrent list subject, there is a lot of friction. In the name of autonomy, in the name of identity, in the name of local politics, pressures, etc., education will continue to suffer. Corruption galore. Huge pilferage takes place. All this needs to be plugged, given the strong political will, social commitment, role of the civil society and different stakeholders. I am sure in the years to come, Indian society would emerge as the front runner in terms of both knowledge generation as well as knowledge dissemination. Thank you very much.
So finally, we can say that the dialogue, or you can say the dilemma, which we continue with the modern education started from where, still continuing that. So what is the panacea? How can we come out of it?
Panacea lies more in implementation than in discussion. We had plethora of surfeit of discussion. The time is to act. Right to Education Act was in that sense a step in right direction.
Okay.
But we need its implementation.
Okay, so well friends, with this word we need a better implementation management, monitoring and innovation, so that we can realize the goal of education and whatever the diagnosis and the recipe is on the plate, so we can have to just to do a little better, so that we can encourage or we can ensure a better future. So with this word we conclude the lecture. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf I thank Dr. Deepak Kumar for giving such an insightful lecture on this very topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.